Welcome to Mid-Level Adventurers, a podcast where non-experts talk about the things they love. I'm Jarrod, and with me for this first series, as always, is my co-host, Matt Morris.
Hello everyone, it's Matt Morris.
In this first series dedicated to Dungeons & Dragons, we have talked a lot about the theory of the game, how to make a character, how to make a world, and what we feel the objective of the game is. But what we haven't talked too much about is actual gameplay. But what do you need in order to play? What can help you make informed choices? Do you have a rules question? Do you have a question about how a certain spell or ability is intended to work? Let's talk about some of the resources that can be very helpful before, during, and after gameplay. So I guess the first question is, what is a D&D resource? To me, I think that the first resource is the player handbook, followed by the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monster Manual. Those are the three quote-unquote core rule books, and they will cover most anything that comes up when you start playing your game. There are other source books that have a lot of additional class information, new spells, new feats, updates on certain rules, but a lot of those can also be found online through other sources, such as D&D Beyond, Sage Advice for clarifications on rules. There's many Reddit forums. There's a Dungeon Master subreddit. There's a D&D Rules subreddit. But where do you buy the player handbook if you're interested in learning how to play? First option is you go online, you go to D&D Beyond, you can buy a digital copy there. You can buy a hard copy from online retailers. But I really suggest, if you have one in your area, going to your FLGS. That would be your friendly local gaming store. They are almost always guaranteed to have copies of D&D books. And I think it's the best place to go because it supports a small local business and it's providing employment to your community.
Well, I mean, it is an excellent resource, like you said, because you get the added benefit of talking to a knowledgeable person.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have any questions before you make said purchase, there you go. I'm sure they're going to be more than happy to help you out. Socially distanced, of course.
Yes. The gaming store is, of course, another valuable resource, especially if you're just starting out, because you can ask those questions of someone who might have the knowledge, and there's probably other people there who may need a player or may be interested in having you learn from them as well.
Yeah. When I lived in Charleston for a bit, the local game store, there was always a game going on, and they were always inviting, or if it was a game you never played, you could sit and watch and ask questions. Going to a local bookstore is definitely a great resource. Like we said, you've got someone there you can speak with that's going to answer any questions. You might catch some players, actually playing a game. Yeah, and you're going to get the book that day, so you don't have to wait for shipping. That might be worth spending extra money to support your local business. So it's probably a win-win.
Yeah.
But if you do want to go online, like Jarrod mentioned before, obviously this is the time of COVID, so shopping online is definitely a thing. D&D Beyond is a fantastic resource, and there is a lot of information available completely free just right off the bat before you have to make a purchase of any kind on the player's handbook, etc., etc. A lot of the stuff, just getting into the core rules and starting a character, is all available there.
Mm-hmm.
And it's free.
Yes. Beyond D&D Beyond, there are many other online resources that I find personally useful. I find Kobold Fight Club to be very useful, Goblinist. They're kind of great for generating random encounters and figuring out what kind of creatures would be in a terrain. And I think Donjon is really phenomenal. It's an online resource generator, so it generates not only encounters, but loot tables, dungeon maps, NPC names, initiative trackers. It'll generate just like anything you want it to do. And there are countless wikis and forums that you can search and find information if you're looking for something specific before you start your gaming adventure.
Yeah, Wikidot, I think, comes to mind.
That is one. I have a slight problem with that. They don't have filters on homebrew custom rules versus like official content. And I'm a big fan of homebrew content, but
Sure.
I don't want one of my players to find something that was crafted to be ridiculously overpowered for someone's campaign and just assume that's how it works.
Yeah, that's fair. It is, it's a wiki, right? So it's not an official source.
Mm-hmm.
It's specifically for 5e, it's dnd5e.wikidot.com.
Correct.
Use that at your own discretion.
Yeah.
Here's a random one that I've looked at occasionally, if you've heard of it. RPGbot? RPGbot.net, actually. The person that makes the page, it kind of designs the information there from maybe a min-max perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So, maybe take it with a grain of salt. I don't take everything he says as like, oh, you have to build a character this way. But he gives a breakdown of the strengths and weaknesses of different species and classes, which is kind of helpful at an overview.
And certainly if you're just starting out, and the idea of customizing beyond the basics is a little daunting.
Yeah, absolutely. And it gives some good tips for, if you're making your first druid, for instance, maybe these are some good spells that'll get you a little longer, a little further in the game, and you won't be kicking yourself later. You don't have to take it, as scripture, of course, but it's a good guide. It's a good start. Yeah.
Right. So that is one kind of resource that you find useful before a game. And you've talked about how it's useful with RPGbot.net. As someone who DMs a lot, I like to look kind of outside the games before I start playing them for inspiration. So I look at fantasy novels, I look at art, I look at online forums, like what other people have done in their games. And for mechanical things, I go to Reddit. And of course, I also go to DM's Guild, which is an entire community of people who create content for Dungeons and Dragons that's not official content, but it's endorsed by Wizards, like Wizards kind of cultivates it, but it is not official content. Pretty much all the D&D adventures are available on there, including extra resources that are made by people who create Adventurers League content or a variety of other things. Matt Mercer has stuff up on there, and countless other DMs and creators have made stuff that's up there. Also, like music lists on YouTube are really good for me to kind of give me some background music and kind of give me a feel for something. Like if I'm creating a dungeon, I want like a creepy playlist, or do I want a loud ruckus battle-y playlist? Just to kind of flood imagery into my brain. But those are very DM specific.
I think as a player, though, it's not a bad idea necessarily to dip into some of the information available for DMs. I think there's still some things to learn there, or like you mentioned, Reddit, to learn from the advice of other experienced DMs who very often were experienced players before they became DMs. Do you have any specific, you mentioned one already, but specific Reddit pages that you go, like, groups that you go to on the reg?
I actually go to Reddit usually when I'm like thinking about a ruling or a rule question, and usually it's just the D&D subreddit or the Dungeon Master subreddit. I think there's one that's the D&D rules subreddit that actually goes into more specifics about it.
Yeah.
I'm also really lucky that I am part of a couple of Discords that are loaded with GMs and D&D players, so I can be like, hey, this came up, or I'm thinking of this, what do you people think? This is kind of the scenario. So getting community feedback from people who get the game, know the game, but aren't in your game can be very helpful.
Yeah, I didn't even think of Discord, but that's an excellent idea. And some of these resources are going to be useful probably during a game if something comes up specifically about rules. But from a player's perspective, I think that you should go into a game with an understanding of, what your character can do and how you can use your abilities. So if there's any clarification you need on what a certain feat might do, or a certain spell or a cantrip, that's good to know going in. It's better to know that, or at least have an idea before you get into the situation during an actual play.
Right.
It's good to at least get a thought. And maybe another resource that we didn't mention specifically, but I think we have in the past, is the DM for your game. It's a great resource before your game.
Yeah, absolutely. Because they're going to be able to answer questions about how they are interpreting the world, or any rules or things that they might be changing because they disagree with how the official rules go on that subject, or they haven't seen this other thing that somebody else that you found talks about. And it's good to touch base and be like, hey, I have this in my brain. Is this what's in your brain? If you have anything that pops up as a question.
Sure. Yeah, so maybe come prepared with some questions for your DM. Because you've said in the past, too, the rules are guides. And there are sometimes different interpretations. So your DM may view a ruling differently than the person on Reddit, whose advice is also equally valid. But you have to find what works for your table, for your game.
Absolutely. And how about during gameplay? What kind of resources come in handy then, and how do they come into play when you need them? The first resource you really need during gameplay is dice. And whether they are real dice or they are virtual dice are very personal, or can be very personal. Some people are very protective of their dice and don't want like other people's mojo getting in on them. Other people couldn't care less and don't worry about having a matching set. Some people have different sets for every character that they play. People are very much kind of dice hoarders in a weird way. It's a very popular thing in the D&D community and tabletop game playing in general. But there are many ways you can get dice. You can just go to a hobby store and get a basic set for fairly low money. You can pick your own dice, usually out of little bins for like 25 cents per die or something like that. There's also really great companies and creators that make their own dice. They use vacuum molds and create custom dice, or they have factories that make them. A few examples of those would be Level Up Dice, Dice Envy, Die Hard Dice. And those are just companies that make dice. That's all that they do is make D&D gaming dice. And some of them have worked with other creators, and there are people on Instagram and Etsy who take a mold of a die and then create their own dice and make a theme for it that way. I've seen people put little rubber duckies inside of dice, or little skulls or moss or whatever, to kind of create druid dice. I'm going to put some moss in. To create goblin dice, I'm going to put something else in. And it's just really fun to see how creative and what people make out of it.
Yeah.
I'm a fan of physical dice, but given the current situation, I've moved to using a lot of virtual dice in running games online for a variety of reasons. But I do have a love of physical dice.
Yeah, I think physical dice is very valid. But you're right. We're in a digital time for D&D in general.
Mm-hmm.
So personally, I use the digital dice for the online games as just a way to be very transparent about what you're rolling.
Sure.
Not that you shouldn't trust your players, and not that anyone I think would be deceptive, but it's just a way to, at a table in real life, people would be able to see your die, whether they're leaning over your shoulder, maybe not necessarily, but they'd be able to see your rolls. So it's just, I am playing a game though where we're whispering all the rolls to the DM directly through Roll20.
Right.
And then we have, there's other games where you roll out for everyone to see. It's certainly easier. I've been a little mobile lately, so it is easier for me to just have the digital dice as well.
Totally.
But there is something special about having the physical in unique sets, or something that just looks good to you. I know some players really, there's a little I don't want to say superstition, but maybe, yeah, these dice are lucky, so I use these.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Also, when you're playing, I personally use D&D Beyond or the Monster Manual or any source book to look up things that I might need on the fly. I actually use Xanathar's Guide to Everything a lot. It's got a lot of great rule clarifications and goes into depth about, how toolkits work and all sorts of cool new spells and stuff in there. So I really like that as a resource. But that being said, are resources just for answering questions? I don't think they are. As I said, I use them for inspiration a lot of the time. Mm-hmm. Sometimes just by perusing a Reddit thread or somebody's story about a game that they've played, you can come up with any number of interesting ideas.
Absolutely. When looking up spells before, either for effectiveness or just an idea of how, maybe a ruling of them, there are a couple of first level spells and cantrips, like for my druid, that are have some unique boundaries. But I've just reading on people's descriptions or how they've used them sometimes been like, oh yeah, that's very neat. That I like the flavor of that or the idea of that, and I'm inspired by something they've said to maybe decide to choose it or not. Mm-hmm. You were saying you get inspired by these resources.
Yeah, anything you do with a resource that's not just answering a question, I guess.
Yeah, but they are good for answering questions, aren't they?
They certainly are.
Or at least opening discussions.
Yeah, and that brings us to our next point. Are official resources the only valid ones? In this age of internetism, what matters more, raw content, which is rules as written, or the intent behind the rules? And I'm a firm believer in third-party resources. If it makes your game better, then have fun with it. That's why I like stuff that's up on DM's Guild or any other website. A lot of people put up battle maps on Reddit. There's a whole subreddit on battle maps that you can take a look at. And people promote their stuff that they have on Patreon. They're like, here's a free map of this new Patreon pack I have. If you're interested, throw me a couple bucks and you can have all of them, which is a great resource. Yeah, and there's stuff that's on any of those websites for free, or you can pay what you want, or sometimes they do have an associated cost. Official Wizards content isn't the only way to go. If it makes your game better, if you have fun with it, if you think somebody's come up with a cool idea, you can totally nab it and you can tweak it to make it fit your world, your game, your player, whatever. Just if you're a player, talk with your DM about it. And if you're a DM, just don't be a jerk to your players about it.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. I think other resources are great. We'll talk a little bit about this in our next episode, but getting some advice from other players and DMs via YouTube and such, I've learned that there are great ideas floating out there as people have come up with ways to give clarification to rules as written, or just say, hey, this is the rule as written, but this really works well with my game. If you dig deep enough into some rules research, you'll probably come across some of those yourself, and you'll discover that there are some maybe universally agreed upon rules that are like, yeah, this is kind of not great as written, so this is what people go for. Yes. I've seen people do breakdowns on the differences in how a cone spell works, because it's a cone shaped on a square map, but I'm rambling now, but it's just, those are the kind of resources that can help either clarify or adjust some things that may be a little vague even, the rules as written.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a lot of vagueness in some of the rules as written, and whether that was intentional to allow DMs to interpret how they want, or because they were trying to get the book out, I don't know.
Yeah.
But it is definitely something that I have struggled with, and other DMs that I've talked about have also been like, oh, it's kind of vague about this one particular thing. It doesn't really tell you too much, which means it's open to interpretation. And I mean, all the rules in general are open to interpretation. There's no quote unquote correct way to play Dungeons and Dragons.
Right. As long as the table agrees on it. And that may often mean as long as the DM gives you a heads up ahead of time.
Sure. There are definitely, the rules lawyers, and we've talked about those in the past.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. I've seen, and I'll mention this again next week, but I've seen, content creators on YouTube just straight up be like, these list of rules are dumb. Here's how you can implement better rules in your game.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of thing. But it's important, if you as a player come up with a new idea, just like you said, Jarrod, just run it by your DM first.
Yeah, and sometimes inspiration happens in the middle of a fight and you're like, hey, so I have this ability. Does it mean this or could it mean this?
Mm-hmm.
Often if players come up with something that is reasonable, I try to facilitate that idea in a game.
Yeah.
It happened last night, actually. Someone came up with something kind of cool and I was like, sure, we can figure out a way to make this happen.
Yeah, that's awesome. That makes D&D kind of fun too, is it can be flexible like that.
Absolutely. A feature we like to do here on Mid-Level Adventures is the Tavern Corner, where we talk about what we are imbibing this evening. So, Matt, what are you imbibing tonight?
Oh, I'm so excited to tell you what I'm imbibing tonight. I'm back in New York now, and yesterday I went to my favorite little beer store up here in Harlem Hops, and they sort of specialize in just getting local and small breweries products, and either on draft or in bottles and cans. So because it's COVID and you can't drink in the bar, I filled up some growlers, and the one I'm drinking tonight is from Hudson Valley Brewery, and it's called The Secret Life of Plants. I'm not really sure if the name means much, who knows, but Hudson Valley Brewery, very good at making fruited sours. And this is, I don't actually have the can that came in since it's a crowler. So I don't know all the specific fruits it's supposed to be, but it's wonderful. It's just delightful. It's tart, refreshing. It's not too heavy. All in all, delicious beer.
Nice. So you went for a fruity sour tonight.
Fruity sour, yeah.
Very cool.
I know I've been doing the IPAs a lot lately. I'll probably switch back to that next week. Don't worry. That was me pouring some more of this beer.
Well, everybody knows how you like to make noise during this segment, so it's okay.
I haven't touched the can enough. There we go. Now
there it is. Yeah.
You can see it now.
Editor Jarrod is like, what the hell? No!
Stop doing this! And now he's just encouraged me. Now I'm going to continue.
Yeah, I think it's a running gag at this point.
But yes, sorry. What are you imbibing now that we're done with my shenanigans?
Well, I am actually imbibing a New York beer myself this evening. I am drinking a Crisp from 6 Point Brewery, which is their Pilsner.
Yes, I love 6 Point.
Yeah, they do a lot of IPAs, so I'm not surprised that you love them.
Yeah.
But I saw that they had a Pilsner, and I was like, ooh, I'll give that a shot. And yeah, I like it.
Good. I don't know if I've actually tried their Pilsner. Probably unsurprising.
It has almost a bit of a twanginess to it.
Okay.
It's not bad. It's not super aggressive. Just right on the roof of your palate, there's just a little bit of a pull.
Okay.
When you first take a swig.
So an Americanized Pilsner to a degree.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Okay. They make, if you haven't tried it yet too, the Bengali is kind of like the New York beer for when you want something that's local, cheap, and easy to drink. I think it's just a blonde ale or something.
I did see it actually on the shelf.
Yeah.
Almost got it.
But they also make some good IPAs. Maybe I'll have one of those next week.
Very nice. Well, that is what we are imbibing tonight. And we've kind of already talked a little bit about how dice are kind of a fun accessory, so I don't want to go too much more into that. But what other accessories are resources to you?
Well, I think this would be two different discussions if we were to compare physical tabletop action to what most of us are doing now, which is digital. So I'll stick to the digital experience. But some fun, gaming accessories and resources. You mentioned earlier music.
Mm-hmm.
That can be a simple but really effective way to just set the mood, or as simple as we have battle music whenever you roll initiative. It makes things interesting. Roll20 actually has some interesting accessories to their platform. The thing we've tried with our game has been dynamic lighting.
Mm-hmm.
which has been really cool, actually. I've gotten quite used to it, and it's just something you can't do on a physical table.
True.
So I actually quite like that.
Yeah, dynamic lighting is really fun. In terms of physical gaming, you have this in some virtual games too, if you are using something like Roll20 where you need a token to represent your character.
Yeah.
Creating character art or finding character art or whatever you do, drawing a stick figure, picking a color and going with it.
Mm-hmm.
Minis are just cool. Maps are amazing. Like having a cool battle map, if you're doing a tactical combat kind of game, that's really a lot of fun. And sometimes maps can provide interactions that you didn't necessarily think about before the combat.
Yeah.
Oh, hey, this map just happens to have a waterfall on it. I guess there could be something in a cave behind that waterfall, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Even just a really good map that you find randomly or a cool looking mini that you see on a shelf or a website can inspire an entire encounter or even a campaign.
Oh, yeah.
And again, you can never have enough dice.
Yeah, that's true.
You can find a cool set of dice online and be like, wow, those would be really cool for this necromancer I've created. And
yeah,
there you go.
I've been holding off on buying the physical dice until I get a chance to use them. So that's been my self-imposed budget. Not that they're that expensive, but I'm glad you mentioned minis and maps because I have some friends that have done some wonderful, and you have too, have done some wonderful, amazing things with making the character tokens, from as simple as doing some basic Photoshop and then printing out that image and putting it on cardstock and then something as a base to 3D printing, which is an option these days. I think nowadays almost everyone probably has a friend that owns a 3D printer.
And a lot of public libraries as well.
And a lot of public libraries, yeah. And battle maps. I've seen you personally do some very cool things, Jarrod, with props and, foliage that you've crafted.
Oh, yes. Scatter terrain.
Scatter terrain. Ah, okay. Yeah, it makes it very... You can do some cool things with lighting digitally, of course, but I'm a visual person. I like the tactile things anyway, so to see a map with some actual three-dimensional terrain on it, even if it's minimalist, is pretty awesome.
Yeah, just having, a couple of fallen rock walls or bushes or trees or whatever. For my home game before COVID, I had bought a bunch of trees off of a railroad model website, and I just kind of cut them down and glued them onto 1-inch washers, and I'm like, great, I now have trees to put around the map. And it's small and it's little and it doesn't cost very much, but it enhances that level of gameplay if that's the kind of game you want to play.
Sure.
You don't have to play with minis and tokens and maps.
No. It's just whatever makes it more enriching for you. And a lot of that work is ultimately left to the DM, I guess. But if you've got a really awesome token that you've created for a character that you've made for this campaign, by all means, bring it in. Maybe the envy of the table.
Absolutely. That being said, even if you're not playing with miniatures, you might find one and just want to paint it, and you should totally do that. There are people who just paint minis and they don't really play the game, or their game style isn't one where combat is tactical on a battle grid. It's more theater of the mind, but they just like painting the minis. And I'm all for that. Painting minis can be a lot of fun and very rewarding in terms of a creative outlet, in terms of just creating something fun for you to look at, to have and be like, I made that and that inspires me and I feel good about it. And I have a little thing to show off if anybody ever wants to know about it. I myself have painted 3 miniatures now.
The dragons, right?
Yeah, and I had never painted a miniature before COVID. I won some trivia contests, and so they sent me these minis as a reward, or as the prize, I guess. And I had never painted a mini before. I was like, well, I have them. I might as well do it. So I watched the quote-unquote official paint tutorial online and looked up how other people had done a few things. And I was like, cool. I'm just going to try some stuff with the really crappy paints that I have and the really crappy brushes that I have. Because starting out from nothing, I happen to have the little acrylic paints from other projects. I just went for it, and I had fun doing it, and
they look great.
The results weren't bad.
Yeah, I think they look great.
They're definitely learning experiences, but yeah.
Sure, yeah. That's going to be a cool thing to display on the next physical tabletop when your players are both horrified that they're fighting a black dragon, but also like, wow, look at that black dragon. He looks good.
Right. I'm excited about it. Well, wrapping up this conversation on D&D resources, Matt, do you have any other insights you might like to provide to people?
No, I don't think so. I think we covered some good stuff. I think perhaps when we post our social media things, we'll probably list a few of these that we've discussed today so people can have a quick glance at the resources that we discussed.
Yes, we are definitely up for promoting resources that we like to use and people who we go to for advice or inspiration. So when we launch this podcast episode, we will definitely tag a few folks and be like, hey, these are some of the people we referenced in this episode. So keep your eyes out for that.
I think that's all I got.
My final thoughts are really just beyond the basic resources of the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual. Use whatever you want to make your game better. And that doesn't mean you can't draw from other RPGs as well. If there's a cool mechanic in Final Fantasy that you want to bring into your game, do it.
Mm-hmm.
As the Dungeon Master, you can totally just do that and tell your players, hey, this is what we're going to do. As a player, you can be like, oh, have you ever seen this cool thing in the Star Wars mechanics for the Star Wars role-playing game? Bring that into your DM, maybe. It's a game. You can modify it. You can make it work for you. There's no rule in Monopoly that whoever lands on free parking gets the money in the middle, but some people play it that way.
You're right. Play, learn, and then maybe you'll have some cool ideas for how to do some homebrew or to change some things. I have a friend that played a game with before, and after playing multiple iterations of different tabletop games, he decided to just kind of write his own.
I love that.
Yeah, it's very cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, just keep playing, keep learning.
Keep playing, keep learning. That's our new hashtag. Well, we would like to thank you all for joining us on this adventure, and join us on our next podcast where we talk about some of our favorite online creators and forums that help us answer our own D&D questions. So similar topic, but we're going to actually throw out some specific shout-outs.
Mm-hmm.
And remember to check out our friend and the composer of all the music we use on Mid-Level Adventurers, John D. Ivy, on SoundCloud.com. Please follow us on Twitter and Instagram at MidLVLAdventure.
And please check out our website on Wix at midleveladventurer.wixsite.com. And feel free to email us at midleveladventurers@gmail.com.
And as always, I'm Jarrod Jehoda.
And I'm Matt Morris.
And until then, mind the traps and keep adventuring.